the day before yesterday, back in the prehistoric era, I was discussing how the music of Lohengrin is very much cut of one cloth. That the overwhelming majority of Lohengrin, much more than any of other Wagner's works, is sort of variants of or visions of a single body of music. And the single body of music from which an extraordinary large amount of Lohengrin derives is the prelude. It almost would have been worthwhile if I hadn't had more time to listen to the prelude, but I'll play the little snippets of the prelude and show you the ways in which they're used. Now, there are two exceptions for music that are not from the prelude. And those two things which we'll also see. One is the fanfare music. Now, Wagner, I think, like many 19th century composers, perhaps more than any other composer in history, was very fond of fanfares. We all understand what I mean by a fanfare. A fanfare is anything sort of brassy that is based on the simple arpeggio. So, it's a fanfare. In a way, this is also a fanfare. Well, no, I got too far. But anyway, Wagner uses a great many fanfares in his pieces. Certainly, from Townwise, for the interest of the guests in the article. Practically all of Wagner's works, I'm just going to talk from here, you can all hear me, right? Practically all of Wagner's works feature a large number of fanfares. None, though, comes even close to Lohengrin. And one of the reasons is that Lohengrin features the fanfare is very much the voice of the chorus, the voice of the military side, the political side of the work, also of the formalistic, the judgment side, I can think of no wedding scene, for instance, which is so completely defined by fanfares as this one. I mean, there's wedding music which is not, which all derives from the prelude, as we'll see, but that's surrounded by fanfares as well. There's a tremendously strong fanfare presence, and to me, the fanfare, in a very sort of naked state, is almost a metaphor for much of the music of Lohengrin. And because fanfare is an extremely static form of music. It doesn't take us especially from point A to point B. The very opposite of the fanfare type of music would be, for instance, let's say the prelude of Tristan. If I start playing, I won't play the beginning, but if I play, for instance, because Wagner has construed it in such a way that the phrases overlap constantly and that we are never finding any kind of resolution. So even purposely, a part of the prelude of Tristan, which is not especially dissonant or chromatic, I'm expecting all of you to remember what I talked about last year about chromaticism versus diatonism. So fanfares, of course, are by their nature almost invariably diatonic. I mean, associated with bugles, with trumpets, which can only play those notes. So it's taps as a fanfare, of a sort. A reveille is a fanfare. So these are all, like bugle type music. But it isn't the diatonic quality so much, it is the very rhythmically contained quality of the fanfare. That it really stays still and sits, it sits very firmly on the ground. And that to me is a very major characteristic of the overwhelming majority of Lohengrin. Is this. So fanfare, in a way, is a good metaphor for the music of Lohengrin. Also, maybe a limitation. Fanfares are sort of emotionally limited in that they almost invariably, at least in these very naked forms, conjure up strength, military might, call to action, aspects of Lohengrin that we perhaps don't like that much, or not the most favorable aspects of Lohengrin, but which are very much there. And it's interesting to note that in In the Ring, Wagner also uses fanfares as a basic element, but they've been transformed from being a metaphor for military action, for judgment, and this very, very stable thing to nature. The nature motives in the Ring, for instance, like or many, many others, are all basically fanfares too. But their context and their use is remarkably different. In themselves, they are just as static. They are also static. The difference is that the context in which they're used is far, far less static. And then there is also a very small portion of music in Lohengrin, which is neither derived directly from the prelude, as we'll see, which would be all basically, I won't say Grail music, but music that has some tie to association, associated, for us at least, to the Grail, to the good guys. One of the interesting things about Lohengrin, that actually saves Lohengrin, is that even though both Elsa and Lohengrin have practically identical music, and very much come musically and sound-wise from the same world, they are in opposition. And indeed their opposition leads to the tragedy of the work. Certainly it's a very, very tragic work. So it's not, so if we look at this as opposed to, for instance, most of Wagner's operas that are based on oppositions. Tristan, Tannhäuser, Parsifal, that's three good examples of works of Wagner's where there's basically two kinds of music, or there's more than two kinds, but two kinds of music are set up against each other as symbols of the basic antagonistic forces in the work. In Parsifal, it's the music of transcendence versus the music of suffering, and the transcendence clearly wins. In Lohengrin and in Tannhäuser, it's Venusberg's music versus the sort of solid everyday music of the Wartburg. And that one, it's the choral, you know, the Pilgrim's chorus that clearly wins. In Tristan, it's the music of day versus the music of night, music of sensual glory, let's say, and of transcendence versus the restricted music of duty and daytime. And clearly in Tristan, the music of release and sensuality and night wins. The opposition in Tristan is less clear, but it's nevertheless there. The Ring is based on a different premise. We talked about that. It's been so many years, we'll have to talk about it again soon. Lohengrin, in a way, has this opposition in that the music of Tellermund and Ortrud is very distinctly different from the music of the rest, the fanfares or the sort of general music of Lohengrin and Elsa. But it represents a very small amount of music, so it really can't be seen as the basic opposition. The fact of Lohengrin is that we don't experience Lohengrin as the opposition between forces musically. I mean, in a stage setting, very often, you know, Tellermund and Ortrud are in black or red or some very different color, and the rest are in white or white, black, or silver, or whatever. And you have this kind of opposition as forces. But musically, it's an uneven battle. So let's look at the elements of, first thing is look at all the elements that derive from the prelude. And I would say, I'm not exaggerating, that probably 80 or 85% of Lohengrin derives directly from the prelude. And derives, and repeat something I said the day before yesterday, that it derives not as developments, as something that it comes as sort of organic or working out of the elements, but sort of like as cut from the same cloth. As if you had a big pattern and you were cutting different dresses from this pattern. The dresses exist as entities. They don't especially change. They're not in constant transformation. It's not like leitmotifs in the Ring. Lohengrin is completely different in that respect from the Ring, except for a very small amount of its music. It, on the other hand, shows Wagner as an extremely advanced and clever composer at the idea of transformation, of cutting different patterns from the same basic cloth. In other words, the ability to transform into many different things, which all come from the same thing. And if it were too much the same, of course, it would be unbearably boring. So it's enough to say that it all feels the same. We all resonate. You don't need it. It's not analytically powerful. It's powerful because it all sort of comes from the very same world. But at the same time, it's very cleverly done. So let's look. The number one unit. swan comes in, he says goodbye to the swan. And he retains that for the swan, that little chordal progression in Parsifal as well. We'll go through this later. I'm going to identify the things first. The other one is a melodic and rhythmic idea. That kind of rhythmic feeling. And you were asking me about the 4/4. In fact, it's all 4/4. We're supposed to read it. See, Wagner, this is a rhythm that very much reinforces the 4/4 feeling because the movement. There is only one place in the line where we are in any kind of suspense. Listen again. If I say the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. There's a little bit of a on the 4 because there's a tie, we call it, over the 4th beat. But what that does is it makes it move into the 1st beat. And let me just play for a while, and you'll notice that every single measure of the prelude as it's going on, how the music is moving into the 1st beat, exactly the opposite of what he did in Tristan. In Tristan, that thing, he does everything possible to disguise the beats. He does, you know, what the Italians call salti mortali, which would be backward flips, to not ever to give us the satisfaction of arriving on a good, clear downbeat. This is how he does here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Now, a conductor who conducted it with the emphasis that I just gave would have everybody screaming by about 30 minutes. It would be sort of a John Adams approach. It would have us all completely nuts. But it is there. It is there. It is very much intrinsic to the music. And so it's a very, very important. Now, there's really two other elements in the prelude that need to be emphasized. Now, the prelude moves along without, you guys all remember diatonic, right? Diatonic means that it stays within the notes of the original scale. Here it's A major. So it's all, there are a few notes outside, but they really serve just to reinforce the sense. It's all very clearly and unambiguously A major. And the first time we hear a change, and because it's gone on for such a long time without a change, we hear this change with a great deal of dramatic power. And it's a dramatic change that sounds so much like Lohengrin, it's almost comical, because it is the modulation means change in key, that characterizes Lohengrin. So I'm going to play a little while before so we get into it and then you'll hear it. There's a kind of, and it's very characteristic, that particular one going from, and he uses very cleverly too, the fact that it's a change that can be made immaterially, or both actually, major and minor. He actually does both in this very first time in the prelude. It could be, that doesn't sound so good, it needs to go to minor actually. It's a minor chord, right? That's a major chord. the beginning doesn't it? It has a certain ambiguity. It goes back and forth. It's like a shift of light. If I were going to be a light designer and do lights for the Prelude, it would only be in places like this that would have any change of light at all. And the light would sort of come into something and then go back. It's that feeling of coming in and going back, which is very characteristic of that kind of modulation. And very characteristic of Lohengrin. What's characteristic is, unlike modulations, let's say, in Tristan, or in some parts of the ring. For instance, let me play this one. I'm going to give it very radical, so you'll hear it very clearly. That's Lohengrin. Let me give it a different kind of modulation. And that's a rather different kind of modulation, right? And that's obviously from Tristan, okay? Which is fairly, but even if I take a modulatory world, okay, this is from the ring. It's changing every chord. It's changing every single chord. And it can go on sort of indefinitely. We don't know where it's taking us. Whereas this one, even though it modulates, it's very clear. There's a little ambiguity, major, minor, but there's no real ambiguity. We're never taken from that. And as a matter of fact, doesn't it sound also like church music? One of the characteristics of most traditional church music, especially Protestant church music, which was sung by the congregation and to be for everyone's involvement, is that it's not ambiguous. It evolves that. It avoids ambiguities. It needs to be, and the music of Lohengrin, more than any other of Wagner's scores, including Flying Dutchman, avoids ambiguities. It deals very much, and at least in this, and tonally, in terms of key and harmony, it deals in clarity, in sort of pure colors. And then there's one, okay, so the first idea we have, the traditional real idea, we have this particular modulation, and then the third idea comes in towards the end, and really, a really wonderful passage. After the big climax, with the two cymbal clashes, although there's a glorious, I said yesterday that Wagner didn't do very much about orchestration for percussion, but that's not entirely true. In this particular passage, there's a pianissimo percussion. That's one of those places where you really say, well, Wagner is the master, because it is an extraordinary coup, because it's not something that you would think of. After these big percussion classes, I'll play it and I'll tell you where it is, but it's this downward scale. And then this sort of very expressive moment. And the expressive intensity is it's manifested through this turn. Let me just play it as if there were no turn. You can hear how the turn increases expression. Without a turn, it would be. It's very nice, but here's the similar. Now it's cadence. Closing figure going down. Yes?
Exactly. Actually, Jim referred to this on Friday, that in fact at the end of the prelude we have a denouement. And in fact that cymbal clash is an incredible example of denouement, because actually it recalls the complete prelude. For one moment you have all that music in.
Yeah, exactly.
And it sort of does.
And the closing scale functions tremendously as a denouement. The prelude, it mirrors very well in a way that well-made play, and that the denouement is quite rapid.
That's right.
Once you hit the climax, then it needs to go down quickly, because it's very difficult to sustain. And this is something, by the way, that Wagner continues. The prelude to Lohengrin is an exact model of another famous prelude of Wagner's, although the content is absolutely different. But it's one almost identical to prelude to Tristan. It functions exactly the same way, in that it starts very quiet, it continues with the same material, remarkably different material, builds to an enormous climax, and then rapidly returns to the initial material. The direction is different, but the technique is the same. And it starts, it's not exactly revolutionary, but I can't think of any preludes that do that before. And both the prelude of Tristan and the prelude of Lohengrin, in a way, are summations, as it were. The prelude of Lohengrin, in a way, is a summation of one entire aspect of the work. And indeed, we'll, for instance, hear this music literally very near the end of the opera, at the end of his narration. When he tells the story, when he tells who he is, it sort of has this sort of benediction feeling almost to it. Whereas the prelude of Tristan is a summation of Act 1 of Tristan, not the whole work. At least that's my personal theory. But anyway, so we have these three elements. So let's look a little bit at how we see these three elements throughout the work. And then a fourth element, very important, is that fanfare, which we hear tens of thousands of times. And admittedly, sometimes with tremendous dramatic effect. That scale going down, exactly the same rhythm, actually, precisely the same rhythm. He's just taking one little fragment of it. And then as the chorus makes its whispered comments about her, notice again too, the extraordinary regularity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. The movement's on 4 to emphasize 1. And then we have what they usually call Elsa's motive. Which of course is the exact same music as direct algorithm. I think it's very unhelpful in Lohengrin to think of these as Elsa's motive or this motive. I mean, in the Ring, it's probably a necessary evil to some extent because there's so much use in the Ring of the concept of remembering, of linking one moment to another moment, which is the primary function. One of the big misunderstandings of leitmotifs is that its primary function is to remember an object. But it's not to remember an object, it's to remember a moment. It's more about time than it's about things. It's a question of music, organization music is always about organizing time, of linking one moment of time to another. But here, there's no reason to particularly say this. It just happens Elsa's walking on stage, but it's a reminiscence of an element of the prelude, of the world that was conjured up by the prelude. And we'll hear that over and over again. When Elsa then is now, at this moment that Thomas Mann said is the absolute climax of the quintessential romantic moment, we hear the first time we actually hear the beginning as it was again. And we're going to hear something new. This, let's and if we move on, you get slightly further afoot. Now this one, so when after he comes on, you have to hear the big motor coming in, the cymbals and everything, it all quiets down, and he welcomes the swan. Of course, we're going to hear the same chords that we heard also. The other direction is the same idea. But then this melody, which is sung by the chorus, reading it. This. Lohengrin would have a game, perhaps. One slight moment of real difference. It's the irony about the prayer is that it's in some ways the most conventional thing in the piece. I mean, having this preghiera scene is just utterly conventional for grand opera. And even having the fact that it starts with a single voice without accompaniment, and then everybody comes in bit by bit, it's all very, very conventional. It's as close as Wagner ever gets to real. And by the way, now that I have it in front of me, I can play the whole story. At the end of the prayer, he needs to go back, he wants to get back to the C major. Now the modulation is perfect for him. That's the same as we had in that's the same distance as the modulation that was in the prelude. That is the same basic modulation. So that's fine. But he also wants to get from this little interruption in 3/4 back to his good solid 4/4 time. And he's unbelievably clever with this because he uses the 4/4 you would get. He uses it by interposing it into 3/4 over the 4/4, or into the 3/4 idea. You'll hear what I mean. So here he's. Extremely exciting, right before the fight. By the way, this tune of the fight. just the minor form of, and of course it's just our friend the fanfare. Just now it's in the minor, so it's still very, very elementary material. Then there's one other little bit which is more independent than most of the music of Lohengrin. The wonderful song that Elsa sings that later is taken up by the chorus in exultation at the victory of Lohengrin. Very similar to the rest of the opera, but it's also refreshing. I think it comes in as a very important sort of breath of fresh air. So let's move on to the second act, and the second act also contains lots and lots. Of course, it has one of the longest series of fanfares of anything in Wagner. I don't know if it's longer than the second act of that one's longer, the Dawn, than the military arriving. They're almost the same music, you know.
Yeah.
Very close.
One goes to sunset, the other one goes.
That's true. That's right. Well, you know, I think in this case, in Lohengrin, every excuse for a fanfare is good.
Yes.
Okay, so what do we just come on? Well, I played some of this last night, the wonderful bridal music. This tune also, I mean, that's slightly different chord, but it's very, very much like the music of the prelude. Very much cut from the same rhythm. Also, all the movement is on the fourth beat, which emphasizes the first beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. On the strong beats, you know, there's a 4-beat phrase. The phrases are 4 measures long. This is as symmetrical a music as you can get. So you have 4 phrases. You have 4 phrases of 4 measures, all in 4. And the emphasis being on the 1 and 3 of the strong things, and making the emphasis by moving to the downbeats of the first and third of each of the 4. So everything emphasizes the very stately, statically moving forward, but in a very sort of stately manner way. It's not necessarily that that's bad. There's just an awful lot of it in Lohengrin, but what it does do is it gives Lohengrin this very stately, ritualistic, formal feeling. It creates also a mark, since this is the most, what is it, a 25-minute procession that gets interrupted several times. It gives a wonderful background for interruption, because he can build it up each time. I mean, it's so, it moves forward, but it doesn't really go anywhere. You can see when it does move, that's gone somewhere, right? But it's on the 4th beat, and then it comes right back to the strong beat to the same place where it started. And it goes away again. And now on the 4th beat. And we're 4. So it has this way of going away and coming back, going away and coming back. Also, this very very regular manner. And then it's followed by another this part is practically lifted directly from the prelude. It's almost exactly the same notes as the main part of the sort of onward long melody of the prelude. One thing that Wagner does here is very interesting. You know, Wagner talks about the endless melody. And when we think of the endless melody in Wagner, we almost invariably think of it in terms of Tristan, of this endlessly never-ending phrasing going over. But it works here too. He writes endless melody of a completely regular sort, because it doesn't, the Tristan one constantly moves forward but never arrives. This one sort of seems to hang in space, suspended. He didn't come back. He moved up one step. And it starts it all over again. Very stately, but it really can kind of go on indefinitely. It really does. And of course, what that does is it makes the interruptions that much more powerful, because it creates a sort of sense of utter timelessness. And all this material is sort of vaguely taken from the prelude. It all feels very much of a piece. This doesn't disturb us in the slightest. You know, there's plenty of precedent for this in Beethoven. And certain works of Beethoven where everything seems to come from the same thing. The difference is that usually in Beethoven, or almost invariably in Beethoven, not always, but usually, the material is always changing. Here there's this kind of sense of complete eternal static quality, eternal, like this, it's like it is the way it is and will always be that way kind of feeling, unmoving quality. If we move, I could go on with this act. Let's move on. Yes, definitely. In the last act, we also have some new material which directly grows out of the prelude, and it's the. Well, it would be better to look at this music from another standpoint. Let's go back to one other little current, which is the fanfare. So from the fanfare, also we have, of course, this combines the melody line actually comes from the prelude. Is the fanfare as sort of a free invention from that same idea. And so we have, and actually listed in his fantasy does a great job because he emphasized that. How it ends. march is an allegorical, and which sort of fits as sort of the fanfare represents the kind of legalistic, in this case not militaristic, but legalistic, formalistic aspect, and it fits right in. Whereas the second part of the wedding march the same, which is another one of the reasons why a place like this that's not from that's a different harmonic world. And it's actually a hint of sensuality. One of the things which is completely missing from Lohengrin, it seems to me, which is definitely present in Flying Dutchman and very much present, especially in the Paris version, but that doesn't count. But even in the Dresden versions of Tannhäuser is sensuality, which is a very important element in Wagner's view of the artist. And it's kind of an interesting view the view of the artist of Lohengrin seems to be one that doesn't have that element. You know, we'll talk very much, since we're doing that for sure, Tannhäuser next year. One of the things about Tannhäuser is that Tannhäuser is about how artists have to be inspired both by St. Elizabeth and by Venus. They need them both, and it's only really when they can fuse the two elements, the sort of the pure love and the passionate love, that they can produce true art. And yet, maybe Lohengrin's failure is precisely that he seems unable to deal with sensuality. Getting to a rather large subject, sort of anticipating our Tannhäuser next year. That's very central. Very, very central to Tannhäuser. Okay, let's move on now, because I'm almost at the end, to a couple of other kinds of music. One other kind of music, well, there's one other phrase that I can't resist playing, because it's so glorious, and we've already heard it, but I'm going to play it too, is this one. Engines of melodic creativity that was ever conceived of. The whole idea of the prelude, which is this long, continuous melody, not in the Tristan-esque sense where it's constantly looking for a resolution that it never finds, but in the state of sort of suspended and serene suspended animation, is really quite unique to Lohengrin. And really, musically, the real special quality that gives so much of Lohengrin, that a piece can be both static and flowing, is really quite special and I think quite characteristic of Lohengrin. Now there is a little bit of something else. There's the music, of course, of Ortrud and Tellerman. Most of Tellerman's music in the first act is mostly shouting, actually. He doesn't get a lot of really definable music, but we get a lot of definable music. And it's very good. Of course, we know that's the diminished seventh chord, sort of the opposite in the vocabulary of the fanfare. It's sort of the anti-fanfare chord. It's the chord of music in the rings, the world of the ring and the ring, the whole body of music from the ring. This is one of the reasons this part sounds so much like the ring. But also here, he still has these nice long melodies. And then he comes to the original tune, which is based on this diminished seventh. Of all the tunes, motifs in Lohengrin, this is the one that sounds most like the ring to me. And it's the one that most lives itself, although he doesn't do very much of it, to actual development. He does a little bit here. so unlike the music of Lohengrin. It's so kind of pushing forward, kind of and developing. So if you want to know what musical development is like, that's it. In other words, he takes this idea and he's sort of pushing it. He's stretching it and combining it on itself and squeezing it, making it shorter. But it's all this very dark and diminished seventh kind of music. Now there is one other element, of course, one we haven't heard. The question, the one true leitmotif, I guess you would say, in Lohengrin, is because we associate it with not only an idea, but with a time. We associate it with the time that Lohengrin tells her you can't ask that question. So it's very, very strong. Of course, unlike the motifs of the ring, it doesn't change at all. It undergoes no change, either in musical form or what it means to us. It becomes more, except it does change, you're right, that the second act seems much more menacing. At the beginning, it sounds, to me, disquieting when he stops everything. He says, before he's come in, it's the great thing, and then he stops everything. Wagner says, sing it slowly, and he repeats it twice verbatim, don't ask, it's disquieting. It's sort of this minor chord and everything. When it comes in at the end of the second act, and then where it is. Wagner, that's his favorite closing cadential figures. For instance, the ring ends with Tristan ends with. I won't play it, but it's the same. He changed the ending of Flying Dutchman. One of the things, the only thing he changed in Flying Dutchman in order to have. Sounds like Wagner to me. And it's very interesting because Lohengrin is a piece which is so much about 5-1, about that particular one, that kind of modulation, or that one, which is a 3-1. So 4-1 isn't so characteristic. So what we do here. Actually, does this one not end on 4-1? You know what? Yes, it does. He can't even resist it here. He changes the very, very end of the piece. It has that chord, which it hasn't done it any time before. But he doesn't quite do it because he really wanted to be Wagnerian. The music of almost all combinations that grow out of those two things. And it's music much more like the music of the ring, not just because it's diminished seventh and more dissonant, unlike the rest of the music of Lohengrin, but because it's music that by its nature develops. There's one other little bit of kind of music of Lohengrin that I want to touch on in the exactly 3 minutes I have. Well, 1 minute, because I'd like to get a question. Personally, my very favorite music in Lohengrin is in the scene between Elsa and Orchard. It seems to me that except for that very short moment in the bridal scene, the bridal duet, the only parts of Lohengrin where there's real dynamic conversation going on, where people are meeting people into change in the course of the conversation. Something which is the norm in, let's say, the ring, although it doesn't happen very much in Tristan. Nor in Parsifal. It almost never happens in Lohengrin. People sort of declaim, but they're not actually. One of the reasons why Lohengrin has little development, because that's not really part of the story. People, perhaps Elsa changes. I'm not necessarily in agreement that Elsa changes, but I don't feel that any of the other characters change in one iota. And so why should the music be a constant change if the characters aren't? Maybe the big problem is that if Elsa alone changes, then she's really got a problem. And does Elsa change, or is it her situation? She's so desperate for a savior at the beginning, and then when he comes, then what has she got left, as it were, sort of. Another way, but to me, my favorite music is in the scene. For instance, I'll just play a little snippet of it. In the scene between Elsa, when Orchard is basically seducing Elsa to get into her family. So this is quite different. We have someone getting someone to do something. There's a real situation of dynamic change. See, modulations like that